Any freshman at a mining institute would get a failing grade for a tunnel like this. The supports are crooked, hand-dug, rock types not found in any textbook. Dan sees it right away. Except he shouldn't be seeing anything. The last thing he remembers is the crash of the collapse on his head. So why is he alive? And what is that glowing inscription in the air? Darkness, silence. No hum of fans, no dripping in the gutter, no cracking of rock under pressure. Dan opens his eyes and sees nothing. Then his headlamp flickers on and a beam hits the wall. What lies beneath his fingers isn't coal. It's something cold and mica-like with thin veins. The veins glow from within with a faint blue. Dan runs his thumb over the surface, too smooth for a natural deposit. He sits down. His head doesn't hurt. His helmet is on. His pickaxe is on his belt. The very one with the worn-down right corner of the striking edge. The handle is warm. It wasn't before. A low tunnel, roughly hand-dug. No sign of drilling or blasting. The supports are crooked. Any student would have failed a test for work like this. Dan stands up. His knees aren't shaking. His back doesn't hurt. Yet the last thing he remembers is the smell of coal dust and the roar of the second blast. The roof of the Black Hollow mine is collapsing on top of him. He yanked the foreman from under the beam. He made it. He didn't make it himself. So he's dead. Or in a coma. Or in a place that doesn't fit into any category yet. And then a translucent panel flashes before his eyes. Letters hang in the air. Level 1. Class. Minor. Lowest. Experience to next level. 100. Dan blinks. The panel doesn't disappear. He blinks again. It's still there. So it's not heaven. There wouldn't be an interface in heaven. He looks at the pickaxe. A brand has appeared on the blade. A thin spiral winds its way into the metal, as if someone had engraved it from the inside. This mark wasn't there this morning. The pickaxe has become lighter. And warmer. Dan presses his palm against the wall. The stone hums. It doesn't vibrate from machinery or tremble from an explosion. It hums on its own. Quietly. Steadily. Like a transformer behind geologist Hyogart reports. The object is unknown. The environment is unknown. The tool has been altered in an unknown way. Plan of action. Dig. As always. He chooses a spot. Not at random. 16 years with a pickaxe have taught him one thing. The rock itself tells you where to strike. You just have to listen. A crack runs down from the ceiling slightly to the left of center. The layering changes right there. Strike at the right angle, and the chip will follow the live line. Strike head-on, and you'll get crumbs, dust, and empty exhaustion. Dan strikes. A ringing sound rolls through the tunnel. The chip exactly along the line he read in the rock. A chunk falls at his feet. Clean, as if carved out. A light flashes above his head. Plus 10 experience. Plus 1 to luck. 10 points for a single strike. He needs 100 to reach the level. That means 10 strikes. If every one is accurate. He stares into the darkness of the tunnel. The darkness is silent. Well, hello. Let's get acquainted. Dan strikes again. Plus 10. Again. Plus 10. With every strike, he picks a spot. Reads the cracks. Calculates the angle. Listens to the rock. 5th. 6th. 7th. The rock falls at his feet in even chunks. 8th, 9th, 10th. The panel flashes brighter. Level 2. 200 experience to the next level. Dan freezes. 200. Each level demands more. Progression. But that's later. Right now, something else. The air is moving. Weakly, but moving. So there's a way out somewhere. He heads toward where the draft is coming from. The support is getting worse. One pillar has cracked and is hanging by a thread. 3 tons above, maybe 4. It'll break in the next few days, maybe hours. He memorizes the spot and moves on. The tunnel turns. The air grows fresher. A scent hits his nose. Not coal, not stone. Grass. Moss. The ceiling rises and Dan steps outside. Light hits his eyes. Not sunlight, softer. He shields his eyes with his hand, opens them. A valley squeezed between 2 stone ridges. Grass, trees, a path leading down, and smoke. Someone is burning a fire below. Dan stands at the exit and looks at a world that isn't his.
The sky turns green on the horizon, a single sun. But the clouds are moving too fast. The pickaxe in his hand grows heavier, noticeably. The spiral on the blade fades. He steps back toward the entrance. The pickaxe grows lighter, the spiral brighter. Forward is harder, backward is easier. Dan nods to himself. The tool works underground. On the surface, it's just a pickaxe. He remembers this and heads down toward the smoke.
Toward people, if they're people. The path leads to a village. 20 houses, wooden, dark roofs, crooked fences. At the farthest house, a boy is whittling a stick. He looks up. He sees Dan. He sees the pickaxe. And there is neither fear nor surprise on his face, only boredom. He shouts toward his back. Dan doesn't understand the words, and then he does. The language is foreign, but the meaning comes on its own, as if a panel is translating on the fly. The boy shouted that another vagrant with a pickaxe had arrived. Another one. A woman comes out of the house, thin, tired. Her hands are red from work. She asks where he's from. Dan answers from below. From the tunnel. The woman exchanges a glance with the boy. The tunnel's been abandoned for 5 years. There's nothing to dig there. The vein's dry. Dan stays silent. The vein isn't dry. He saw the rock. The vein ran off to the side and down, but he doesn't say that. He asks what the village is called. Gravel Hook. If he needs food or a place to stay, he should go to the village elder, the house with the red door. The village is poor, you can tell right away, not by the houses, by the people, by the way they move, slowly, heavily. Like those who long ago stopped hoping things would get better. Dan knows that look. He grew up among people like that in West Virginia, in mining towns that died out year after year, until only those with nowhere else to go remained. The house with the red door stands in the center. The door hasn't been red for a long time. It's brown. The paint is peeling. Dan knocks. A man opens the door, about 60 years old, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, hands like shovels, a face like weathered granite. He asks who he is. Dan replies, "I'm a miner." He doesn't know how he ended up here. He needs water and a place to spend the night. The man is silent. He nods. His name is Hank. He's the foreman. There's enough water, enough room, but no work. The mine is dead. Dan enters. It smells of smoke and boiled grains. At the table sits a girl of about 19, blonde hair, fingers stained with ink. A notebook lies before her. She looks up. She looks at the pickaxe, at the spiral. Her eyes widen. She whispers something to her father. Hank replies briefly. He sets a bowl of grits and a mug of water in front of Dan. "Eat. We'll talk in the morning." The girl doesn't take her eyes off the pickaxe. Dan eats. The grits are tasteless. The pickaxe lies on his lap. It's warm even here. Dan asks where the mine is. Hank nods toward the east. "Beyond the hill, but you shouldn't go there. 3 guys were buried 6 months ago. No one has gone down since." Dan nods. He doesn't argue. He'll check it out himself in the morning. They make his bed on a bench by the wall. Hard. He's slept on worse. The light goes out. The pickaxe is nearby. Warm. His last thought before sleep is simple. The mine isn't dead. He knows that. Stone doesn't lie. Dan woke up before dawn. Habit. Miners get up early. The body remembers the schedule, even when the mind doesn't know what time it is. He sat down on the bench. The pickaxe lay next to him, cold. On the surface, it looked like ordinary metal. The spiral on the blade was barely visible. Dan stood up. The house was quiet. Hank was sleeping behind the partition. So was the girl with the notebook. Dan put on his hard hat. He grabbed the pickaxe. He went outside. The morning was gray. The air smelled of dampness and something piney. Behind the hill to the east, the wooden frame of the mine headframe jutted out. It was crooked. The gate for raising the skip stood rusty and warped. The rope had rotted. Dan approached. He examined the entrance. The shaft descended at an angle of 35 degrees to the horizon. An inclined shaft, not vertical. That meant a descent without a hoist was possible. He turned on his headlamp and went down. Supports stood in the shaft every 2 meters. Wooden ones. Half of them were rotten. 3 supports were broken. One upper beam had sagged and was held up only because the rock above it had wedged itself in place. Dan stopped near each broken support. He assessed it. He memorized it. He moved on. The shaft led him to a level section. A small chamber. 5 by 7 meters. 3 drifts branched off in different directions. The left one was blocked. Rock and wood. A cave-in. That very one. 6 months ago. 3 dead. The middle drift went straight ahead. Short. 20 meters. Dead end. Working face. The rock at the face was gray. Dense. Dan walked up. Ran his hand over it. Nice. Medium hardness. But no veins. The locals were right. There are no veins here. The right tunnel. Longer. 40 meters. The supports are still standing. Not all of them. But they're standing. Dan walked to the end. The face. Different rock. Darker. With flecks of something metallic. He brought his headlamp closer. Pyrite. A false lead. Not ore. The locals must have mistaken it for gold. They dug. Realized it was barren rock. Gave up. But Dan wasn't looking at the pyrite. He was looking at the crack. A thin one. Almost invisible. It ran from the floor upward. At an angle. And the layering of the rock changed right next to it. On one side of the crack, the gneiss lay flat. On the other, a bend began. A fold. An anticline. That meant one thing. The strata here had been crushed by pressure. Somewhere nearby, the rock curved in an arc. And if the iron vein ran along this layer, it hadn't ended. It had turned. Gone off to the side. Downward. Under the anticline. The locals had dug straight. The vein had turned. They didn't know. They couldn't have known. To figure that out, you had to be able to read the fold structure. You had to see the crack and understand what it meant. Dan placed his palm on the wall. The rock hummed. Quietly. Like down there in that first tunnel. The pickaxe warmed in his hand. The spiral on the blade glowed brighter. Underground, it was waking up. Dan chose a spot. Not by guesswork. He read the rock. 3 rock. Layering. Angle of dip. The point of impact at the intersection of 2 lines. If he struck here, at a 23-degree angle, the chip would follow the natural plane, the layer would split cleanly, and beyond it, he would see what lay ahead. Dan struck. A ringing sound echoed through the tunnel. The chip fell perfectly. A chunk of rock fell away. Behind it, a dark space opened up. Not a void. Different rock. Darker. Denser. With a sheen. An iron sheen. A vein. Wide. Clean. Dan ran his finger along the exposed ore. Magnetite. Or something like magnetite. High iron content. He struck again. Another chunk of rock fell. The vein went deep. He couldn't see its end. A flash appeared above his head. +10 experience. +1 to hidden luck. Another strike. 10 more. Another strike. 10 more. The pickaxe sang in his hands. Every strike was precise. Every chip was clean. The rock fell at his feet as if it wanted to part of its own accord. In 20 minutes, Dan had opened up the vein 2 meters deep and 1.5 meters wide. The ore was pure, rich, 3 times better than what the locals had been digging up for 6 months. The panel flashed. Level 3. Then level 4. He didn't count the strikes. He worked. It felt familiar. It felt right. Rock. Pickaxe. Point of impact. Chip. Repeat. An hour later, he stopped, wiped his forehead, looked at the result. The vein he'd uncovered ran down and to the left, right along the anticline, just as he'd predicted. Level 5. 370 experience points to level 6. Dan hung the pickaxe on his belt and headed up. He needed some drawing charcoal and a piece of something to draw on. He left the mine. The sun had risen. The village had woken up. 2 men and a woman were standing by the well. They fell silent when they saw Dan. Dusty, black with rock dust, with a pickaxe on his belt, coming from the mine, from the abandoned mine, which no one had gone down into for 6 months. Dan nodded at them. He walked to Hank's house. He knocked. A girl opened the door. May. She looked at him, at the dust, at his face. She asked if he'd been in the mine.
Dan said yes. He asked if there was any charcoal for drawing and a piece of bark, or a board, something flat. May silently took a sheet of paper from her notebook. She handed it to him. Then she found a piece of coal from the stove.
Dan sat down on the porch. He began to draw a cross-section of the mine, a side view, the shaft, the horizon, 3 drifts, a collapse in the left one, a dead end in the middle one, and the right one, with a crack, with an anticline, with an arrow pointing where the seam had gone. May stood nearby and watched. She didn't get in the way. She didn't ask questions. She just watched. Hank came out. He saw the drawing. His face changed. He was a miner. Maybe not an engineer, but a miner. He understood what was drawn on that sheet. Dan explained, briefly, without unnecessary words. You were drilling here, but you should have gone this way. There was no vein here. This is just the tail end. The main body runs 8 meters to the side and down, under the anticline, and this support needs to be repositioned. Otherwise, everything will collapse in a week. Hank looked at the drawing, then at Dan, then back at the drawing. He asked how he knew. Dan replied that he was a mining engineer. Hank didn't know what a mining engineer was. Dan put it more simply. He could read the rock. Hank was silent for a long time. Then he said that 3 of his men had died in that mine 6 months ago. That he himself had nearly died. That the widows of the 3 miners lived in the village and looked at that mine every morning. That if Dan was lying or mistaken, it wouldn't be just a mistake. Dan nodded. He understood. He said he wasn't asking them to take his word for it. He said he would go down himself, alone. He'll prove it, Hank thought. May tugged at her father's sleeve. She said something quietly. Hank looked at his daughter, then at Dan. Then he nodded. The 3 of them walked toward the mine. Hank, Dan, and May, whom Hank didn't want to let go, but who followed them and wasn't about to stop. At the mine entrance, Hank took a torch. May took the second one. Dan turned on his headlamp. They went down. Dan led the way. He pointed out every broken support. He explained, "Here, the load is 3 tons per post. We need a double support. Here, the rock has split. We need a long shield. Here, there's water. We need drainage. Otherwise, in a month, the posts will rot and the roof will collapse." Hank listened. He was silent. He nodded. May followed behind them, writing in a notebook, by torchlight, hastily. They reached the right-hand tunnel. The face, the exposed vein. Hank saw the ore. He stepped closer. He touched it. He looked at Dan. There was something in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but a shadow of hope, a silhouette. Dan raised his pickaxe, chose a spot, struck. 1 blow. A chip came off along the drawn line. Another chunk of rock fell. Behind it, the vein grew wider, cleaner. A light flashed above Dan's head. +10 experience. Neither Hank nor May saw it. The panel was for him alone. Dan struck again, and again. 10. Each one precise. Each one hitting the right spot. The tunnel widened. The ore glistened in the torchlight. May stopped writing. She stood and watched. Hank stood nearby, touching the ore with both hands, as if he couldn't believe it was real. The panel flashed. Level 6, 1,240 experience points at once. Something had changed. Dan didn't understand what, but the number was different. Not 10 per strike, much more, as if the pickaxe had rewarded him for something more than just an accurate strike, for finding a vein for the people who needed it, for the fact that the stone had opened up not just for him, but for the whole village. He didn't dwell on it. He hung the pickaxe on his belt and turned to Hank. He said the vein was big. There'd be enough ore to last for years. But first, they needed to repair the supports and install ventilation. Otherwise, there would be another cave-in, and 3 more widows. Hank was silent. Then he held out his hand. Dan shook it. The foreman's hand was heavy, like stone. They climbed to the surface. Half the village was standing at the mine entrance. The news spread quickly. A drifter with a pickaxe had gone into the abandoned mine. Hank went with him. May went with him. Everyone was waiting. Hank stepped into the light. He looked at his people. He said one word. Or. The village exhaled. Someone laughed. Someone sat down on the ground. One of the widows pressed her hand to her mouth. Dan stood slightly to the side, pickaxe on his belt, hard hat on his head, dust on his face. He wasn't smiling. He was thinking about the supports, about how 3 posts needed to be replaced tomorrow, about how drainage was needed in a week, about how ventilation was the first thing without which nothing would work. Hank came up to him that evening, set a bowl of stewed meat in front of him, hot, with a thick gravy, sat down next to him, was silent, then said, "Son." "Stay." Dan looked at the bowl, at the meat, at the steam rising into the evening air. He hadn't eaten meat since he died, or since he ended up here, or whatever it was. He picked up a spoon. He ate slowly. The meat was tough. The gravy was salty. It was the best meal of his life. He told Hank he'd stay as long as there was work. May sat on the porch with a notebook, taking notes. Dan asked what she was writing. May replied that she was writing down everything he'd said in the mine. Every word. Dan said that half of what he'd said was cursing at the people who set the supports. May nodded. She said she'd written down the curses too, just in case they came in handy. Dan looked at her. She wasn't joking. He almost smiled. Almost. The next morning, Dan drew up a plan. Not in his head, on paper. May gave him 3 sheets from her notebook. For her, it was like cutting a piece of herself off. Paper was expensive in Gravel Hook. Dan could tell by the way she held the sheets, with both hands, carefully. He took a piece of charcoal and began to sketch. The first sheet, a mounting diagram, every post, every top beam, the distance between the fasteners, angles, load, material. He drew quickly and precisely. The lines were straight. May stood behind him and watched. She didn't get in the way. Dan explained as he went. Here, the strut has to stand vertically, not at an angle. At an angle, it acts like a lever and breaks. Here, we need a brace. Boards across the arch, so small pieces don't fall out and loosen the support. Here, we need a solid piece. A pillar of undisturbed rock. You can't remove it. It supports the roof. May took notes. Second sheet. Ventilation. Dan sketched out the system. The main shaft provides airflow from above. A second drift is needed. A ventilation drift. A small tunnel that will connect the adit to the surface at another point. Warm air from the mine rises up the ventilation drift. Cold air from outside flows down the main shaft. Natural draft. No mechanisms. No magic. Just physics. May wrote and drew her notes in the margins. Little arrows. Question marks. Her handwriting was small and neat. The third sheet. Drainage. Water in the mine is the enemy. It rots the support. It washes away the soil. It creates dangerous cavities. We need a channel along the tunnel. Sloped. The water drains into a sump, a pit at the lowest point. From there, it can be lifted out with a bucket, or diverted through the adit if we can break through to an exit lower down the slope. Dan finished the drawings, put down the charcoal. He looked at Hank, who had been sitting across from him and hadn't said a word for the past hour. He said he needed people. 6 people, for 3 days. First, the support, then ventilation, then they can start mining. Hank nodded. He left. Half an hour later, there were 8 people standing in front of the house. Not 6, 8, 4 men, 3 women, and a boy of about 15. Dan looked at them. They looked at him. No one was smiling. They didn't believe him. They believed Hank, and Hank believed him. That was enough. Dan divided up the work. 2 of them are cutting wood for the posts. They need larch or something similar. Straight trunks. No rot. 2 are preparing planks for the lining. 2 clear the debris in the left tunnel. Not all of it, just the passageway. To assess what's beyond it, Dan, along with the boy and one of the women, goes down to replace the first supports. The work has begun. Dan worked in silence. He demonstrated. He explained. Briefly, he did it himself. Then he had them repeat it. He corrected them. Without anger, without irritation. He taught the way his father had taught him, with his hands. He showed. He let them try. He corrected. Again. The boy's name was Toby. Skinny, long arms, quick eyes. He remembered things the first time. The woman's name was Ruth, the widow of one of the fallen. She worked in silence, angry, as if every blow to the wood was a blow to something else. Dan didn't ask. He knew that anger. By evening, 3 posts had been replaced. New ones, straight, vertical. The joint was tightened. The roof had stopped caving in. Dan checked every connection. He wiggled the posts. He tapped the beams. Everything held. On the second day, they started the ventilation drift. Dan chose the exit point to the surface, the northern slope of the hill, 50 meters from the main shaft. They needed to drive a tunnel about 20 meters long, sloping, upward. Here Dan worked alone, with a pickaxe, underground. Every strike gave him 10 experience points. With every blow, he chose the right spot. The pickaxe sang. The spiral on the blade glowed a steady blue. In 6 hours, he had advanced 12 meters, level 7, then 8, then 9.
The rock flew from under the pickaxe like butter a knife. The others hauled out the rock. Toby handed him tools. Ruth secured the supports behind him. She did it well, better than the men up top. Dan told her so. Ruth looked at him. For the first time in 2 days, something resembling a smile appeared on her face and vanished. But Dan noticed. By the day, the breakthrough was complete. 22 meters of tunnel. When Dan broke through the last meter and light flooded in from above, everyone standing in the tunnel felt it. Air began to flow. Fresh, cold. It flowed through the tunnel like water. Toby laughed. Ruth turned her face into the draft and closed her eyes. The draft was working. Natural ventilation. No machines. No magic. Just a temperature difference and a well-chosen exit point. Dan stood by the breach and looked up at the sky through the hole he had made. Level 10. The system flashed. New message. Skill unlocked. Rock reading level 2. Analysis radius increased. Dan closed the panel. He looked at his hands. Calloused. Covered in rock dust. The same hands. The same work. Only the world was different. By the end of the first week, the mine was ready for operation. The supports were in place. The ventilation was working. The drainage channel carried the water away. Dan showed the residents how to mine the ore, not to strike at random, to read the cracks, to look for weak spots. One precise strike instead of 10 blind ones. They didn't understand. Not right away. Not all of them. But Toby understood. Ruth understood. And May, who went down every day with a notebook and wrote everything down. Hank stood at the mine entrance and watched as his men came up one by one, with ore, with full baskets. The first ore in 6 months. The first glimmer of hope in 6 months. He turned to Dan, said he didn't know how to thank him. Dan said he needed proper supports, not made of green wood, but dry wood, seasoned wood. And he also needed a smithy, at least a small one. Hank nodded, said there was no smithy. The blacksmith had left 2 years ago, to the capital. They pay more there. Dan paused. He needed a forge. Without it, he couldn't make tools. He couldn't repair things. He couldn't build. He looked at the ore they were carrying from the mine. Iron. He stood on a mountain of iron and couldn't make a single nail out of it, because there was no forge. He told Hank he'd build a forge himself. Hank raised an eyebrow. He asked if he was a blacksmith too. Dan said no, but he was an engineer. He knew how a furnace worked. He knew the temperatures. He knew the principle of forced draft. He'd have to learn the rest as he went along. Hank shook his head, but he didn't refuse. May was already taking notes. By the second week, Dan was building. In the morning, he'd go down into the mine. He worked with a pickaxe, gaining experience. Level 11, 12, 13. Every strike was precise. Every chip was clean. The pickaxe was warm. The spiral was bright. In the afternoon, he came up and built a smithy out of stone. He hewn every block himself. May hauled the stones. Toby mixed the clay for the mortar. Ruth helped in silence. In 5 days, the walls were up. In 7, the roof was on. In 10, Dan had built the forge. From fire clay he found 2 kilometers from the village. Red clay, with a high aluminum oxide content. He determined this by touch and color. May asked how he knew.
Dan said that red clay with that shade is always fireproof. May wrote it down. He made the bellows out of wood and leather. Toby helped. The boy had nimble hands. The first smelting was a failure. The temperature was too low. The iron didn't melt. Neither did the second. Dan rebuilt the furnace. He enlarged the combustion chamber. He added a second air channel. The third smelting was successful. The iron flowed. Dirty, with slag, but it flowed. Dan stood in front of the furnace and looked at the molten metal. Red, alive, hot. He knew how to smelt ore. He didn't know how to forge, but that was a matter of practice and a good hammer, which he first needed to cast from the iron he had just melted. The circle was complete. Dan smiled. Then he rolled up his sleeves. May stood nearby with her notebook. Level 14. Pickaxe underground. Hammer on the surface. 2 hands. 1 head. Years of work ahead. End of the second week. Level 15. Dan went down into the mine every morning before dawn. A habit. A ritual. A necessity. Every hour underground gave him experience. Every level gave him a new miner class skill. Level 10. Second tier rock reading. Analysis radius increased. Level 12. Vault reinforcement. Passive skill. The supports he installed with his own hands could withstand a third more load. Level 14. Water sense. He could sense underground currents at a distance of up to 30 meters. Level 15. Voice of the stone. Dan stopped when he saw this name on the panel. Voice of the stone. Description. The user hears the internal tension of the rock, distinguishes stable and unstable sections by sound. He closed his eyes, listened, and heard, not with his ears, with something else. The rock around him resonated. A low, steady hum. Stable, safe, but ahead, about 20 meters away, the sound was changing. It was getting higher, sharper. Something was wrong there. Dan moved forward, carefully. He was working in the right tunnel, expanding the face, following the vein. It went deeper and lower, 1.5 meters further every day. The ore didn't run out, but the tunnel kept getting deeper. 20 meters from the shaft, 25, 30, and now he was walking and heard the rock ahead sounding different. He stopped, put his hand on the wall. A vibration, faint, rapid, tension. Something ahead was creating pressure. Emptiness, a chamber, or an old mine shaft. Something behind the wall. Dan picked a spot. He struck carefully, gently, not for the sake of it, for reconnaissance.
The rock echoed hollowly. That's it. Emptiness. An empty space behind the wall. He struck again, more carefully. Another thin chip. A draft. Air flowed through the crack, so the void was connected to something else. Dan widened the hole, slowly, carefully. He chipped away at the rock layer by layer, like a surgeon. Half an hour of work. The opening was now big enough to crawl through. He shone his headlamp inside. A chamber, a large one, 12 meters long, 8 meters wide. The ceiling was high, 4 meters. The walls were smooth, too smooth. Not a natural cavity. Someone had carved this space out of the rock long ago, a very long time ago. Moss lay on the floor, silvery, glowing, dimly, but enough to make out the room's contours without a headlamp. And in the far corner, curled up in a ball on the stone slab, a person was sleeping. Dan froze. He held his breath. He watched. A person. A woman. Young. Thin. Very thin. Long hair. Tangled. Dark. Clothes, if you could call them that. Rags made of something resembling coarse canvas. On the slab next to her stood clay pots. Small ones. Dozens of them. Something was growing in some of them. Mushrooms. Pale, thin, with long stems.
Shelves ran along the wall, carved directly into the stone. On the shelves, flasks, retorts, tubes, glass, ceramic, cloudy, clear, of various sizes, a laboratory. Dan stood in the doorway and looked at the underground laboratory where the woman lived alone on mushrooms and sheer stubbornness. He thought of two things at once. First, she needs help. Second, the ventilation here is awful. He stepped inside. His foot crunched on the stone. The woman woke up instantly, not like a human wakes up, like a beast. She darted toward the wall. A flask appeared in her hand, a small one, with something green inside. She held it like a grenade. Her eyes, wide open, black, mad, beautiful. She said something, quickly, sharply, the same language. The system translated. She told him not to move, that there was acid in the flask, that it would dissolve his face in 3 seconds. Dan didn't move. He raised his hands, palms forward, slowly. The pickaxe hung from his belt. He didn't reach for it. He said he was a miner, from the village up above, that he'd broken through the wall by accident, that he wasn't going to hurt her.
And that she should ventilate the room, because the carbon dioxide concentration here was clearly above normal. The woman blinked. The flask in her hand didn't waver. She asked what he had said. Dan repeated it. About the carbon dioxide. She asked how he knew about the gas concentration. Dan said he could sense it, by the way the flame burned, by his own breathing. The flame on her homemade lamp burned low and yellow, so there wasn't much oxygen. The woman looked at the lamp, then at Dan, then back at the lamp. She slowly lowered the flask. She didn't put it away, she just lowered it. She asked who he was. Dan said, a miner. Level 15, lowest class. The woman snorted. She said that lowest class was putting it mildly. She said that level 15 miners didn't exist. 9th level at most. After that, the system stops granting experience because the stone isn't considered a worthy source. Dan said nothing. She was wrong, but he wasn't going to explain about the pickaxe. Not now. He asked her name. She paused. Then she said, Soren Ash. Alchemist. Former. From the capital's college. The former one. Dan asked how long she'd been here. Soren said 2 years. Approximately. She'd lost count of the months 8 months ago. Dan looked at the mushrooms, at the flasks, at the rags. 2 years. Alone. Underground. On mushrooms. With acid as her only defense. He asked why she was here. Soren said she had been accused of heresy, for brewing potions from underground mushrooms. The college believed that true potions can only be made from blessed surface herbs. Mushrooms are filth. The underground is filth. She is filth too. That's why she fled. Down. She found this cell. She stayed. Dan nodded. He looked at the shelves, at the flasks. Some were labeled, in small handwriting, neat, like May's. Only the letters were different. He couldn't read them, but he saw the system, the order, the classification. This woman had lived alone in the dark for 2 years and kept working, kept brewing her potions, kept recording the results. Dan recognized that stubbornness. He saw it in the mirror every morning. He told Soren that there was a village up above, warm houses, food, people, that she didn't need to live here, that he would widen the passage and install ventilation. Soren looked at him, for a long time, silently. There was something, suspicion, fear. And somewhere deep, very deep down, hope. She said she couldn't go up, that if the council found out, they would find her. Dan said the council wasn't looking for people in a village that wasn't even on the map. Soren didn't answer, but she didn't say no either. Dan went back to the tunnel. He worked until evening. He widened the passage, made it more comfortable. He dug a ventilation shaft from Soren's chamber to his own. Fresh air began to flow. Soren's lamp burned brighter,
wider. Oxygen. Soren stood by the wall and watched as the flame changed color. Then she looked at Dan. She said he was the first person in 2 years who had spoken to her. Dan said he talks to everyone, even to a rock. Soren didn't smile, but she stopped holding the flask of acid. He went upstairs. He told Hank. He said a woman lived downstairs, an alchemist. 2 years, alone. Hank was silent for a moment. Then he said that in Gravelhook they don't turn away those who have nowhere else to go. May was already packing a basket with food, bread, dried meat, apples, a blanket. The next day, May went downstairs with the basket. Soren didn't want to take it. May left the basket by the entrance and left.
An hour later, the basket was empty. On the third day, Soren came upstairs. She squinted in the light. She was unsteady on her feet. May took her by the hand and led her to Hank's house. Soren sat at the table and ate soup, silently, slowly. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't wipe them away. Dan sat across from her and said nothing. There was no need to speak. He knew what it was like. When you're alone for a long time. When you're not alone anymore. Words are superfluous here. Level 16. The system didn't grant experience for saving people, but the pickaxe grew warmer again. Third week. Dan worked according to the schedule he'd set for himself. Morning, the mine, the pickaxe, experience, skills, every strike on the right spot, every chip clean. Level 17, 18, 19. His skills grew. Third level rock reading. He could see the rock structure 10 meters ahead without looking. He could feel the cracks with his fingertips. He knew where the chip would go before he even raised the pickaxe. Second level voice of the rock. He could distinguish 7 types of rock sounds: stable, tense, water saturated, hollow, ore bearing, crystalline, and one more, one he couldn't identify yet: deaf. Dead. As if the rock in that spot had ceased to be rock and become something else. He encountered that sound twice, both times deep, below the main horizon. Both times he didn't dig in that direction. For now. Day, surface, the forge, working with metal. Dan was learning to forge. Slowly, clumsily. His first nails were crooked. The second ones were slightly straighter. The 10th ones were usable. He forged nails, staples, hinges, tools. Simple, rough, but functional. Toby stood nearby and pumped the bellows, learning, memorizing. May came with a notebook and recorded melting temperatures and heating times. Soren came and watched, silently. Then she started bringing her own notes. She knew chemistry, not like Dan, differently. Through alchemy, through potions, through reactions that they called magic here, but would simply call chemistry back home. She asked Dan if he knew what a flux was. Dan said he did. She asked what would happen if they added powder from a certain mushroom to the melt. Dan asked which one. Soren pulled a small bag out of her pocket. Gray powder. It smelled like metal. She said this mushroom grows on ore deposits. It absorbs minerals. If you add it to the melt, it acts as a natural flux. It draws out the slag. It purifies the metal. Dan looked at the powder, then at Soren, then at the furnace. He said, "Let's try it." They tried it. The metal came out cleaner, significantly cleaner. Dan held a piece of iron in his hands and couldn't believe his fingers. Smooth, solid, even, no pits, no slag. Soren stood nearby and smiled for the first time ever. A small, wicked, triumphant smile. She said that was why they called her a heretic, for the mushrooms that make metal purer than prayer. Dan nodded. He wasn't surprised. He'd heard stories like this. In his world, people were called heretics too, for being right too soon. They started working together. Dan knew physics. Soren knew local chemistry. Together, they were dangerous. First result, an antidote for mine gas. Dan explained to Soren what was killing the miners in the minutes. Methane, carbon monoxide, lack of oxygen. Soren listened, nodded, said she had a fungus that absorbed certain gases. What if they made a paste out of it and applied it to fabric? It would make a filter. Dan looked at her, said she had just invented a respirator. Soren didn't know what a respirator. Dan explained. Soren said she had 3 books on gas theory, and none of them mentioned such a device. Dan said that in his world, respirators had been invented 200 years ago. Soren fell silent. Then she asked what he meant. In his world. Dan paused. Then he told the truth, briefly, without details. He's from another world. He died, or didn't die. He's here. He's a miner. From a family of miners. 3 generations. He knows things that no one here knows. Not because he's smarter. Because his world has been digging longer. Soren looked at him. For a long time. Then she said that explained a lot. Then she said it didn't explain anything. Then she went to make the filtering paste. They worked until nightfall. They got covered in soot and mushroom powder. The paste turned out on the 3rd try. Gray, sticky, with a pungent smell. Dan applied it to a piece of cloth, dried it over the stove, held it to his face, breathed through it. The air passed through. Clean. Without the smell of coal, without the taste of gas. It works. Soren stood nearby, covered in soot, with dark circles under her eyes, holding a suspicious mug in her hand. She raised the mug. Said this was the first invention they wouldn't call heresy. Dan raised his mug. Water. They clinked mugs. Soren looked at him over the rim of her mug. Something had changed in her eyes. The suspicion was gone. The fear was gone. Curiosity remained, and something else, warm, indescribable. Evening. Dan was sitting on the porch of Hank's house, looking at the stars, other stars, not his. May was sitting next to him, with a notebook, as always. She asked what he was thinking about. Dan said he was thinking about school. May didn't understand. What school? Dan said we need a school, here, in Gravelhook, for miners, not for warriors, not for mages, for those who work underground, to teach them how to read the rock, how to set supports, how to install ventilation, how to calculate the load. May was silent. Then she said quietly that things like that don't happen, that miners aren't taught anywhere. You're born a miner, or you become one when there's nothing else left. No one builds schools for those who dig. Dan looked at her. He said that in his world they do. That in his world, a mining engineer studies for 5 years, that his father didn't study and lost 3 fingers, that his grandfather hadn't studied and died of black lung at 52, that he himself had studied and led 8 people out of a mine that was collapsing, because he knew where to go, because he knew how to read the rock. May listened. Her eyes shone. She wrote it all down, every word. Then she said, I want to learn. Dan nodded. Take the pickaxe, he said. I'll show you tomorrow. May looked at him. Dust and exhaustion on his face, calluses on his hands. He was offering her what she'd wanted her whole life, and what no one had ever offered her before. To go underground, to learn, to understand. She clutched her notebook. She nodded. In the morning, May went down with him. With his spare pickaxe, small, light, Dan placed her by the wall of the tunnel. He said, Watch. He put his hand on the rock. He pointed out a crack. He explained the direction. He showed her where to strike. He struck. A chip. Clean. Then he said, Now you. May raised the pickaxe. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from excitement. She struck. Crooked. The chip went the wrong way. The rock crumbled. Dan didn't flinch. He said, Nothing. One more time.
Harder.
And a little to the left. May struck again. Better. Not perfect, but better. Dan nodded. He said, "Good."
Remember that feeling. When the pickaxe hits right, you can feel it. The stone tells you. They worked for 3 hours. May was tired. Her hands ached. Her palms were raw, but she didn't complain. Not once. When they went upstairs, she walked with a smile. A wide one. An open one. Hank was standing at the entrance. He saw his daughter, with a pickaxe, covered in dust, with scraped palms, with a smile. His face went stiff. He looked at Dan, for a long time, intently. Then he turned and went into the house. May stopped smiling. She watched her father walk away. Then she looked at Dan. Dan understood. May's mother had said the girl didn't go down the mine. Hank had lost 3 men underground 6 months ago. His daughter had gone down there, with a man he'd known for 2 weeks. Dan followed Hank. He found him behind the house. Hank was sitting on a log, sharpening an axe, silently, angrily. Dan sat down beside him. He was silent. Then he said that May was smart, that she picked things up on the first try, that she had good hands, that he wouldn't let her go to a dangerous place.
That he knew better than anyone in this town where it was safe and where it wasn't. Hank didn't answer. He kept sharpening the axe. Dan said he understood, that his own father didn't want him to go into the mine, that his mother cried when he enrolled in the mining institute, that they worried about him every day, and that he went anyway, because the rock was in his blood, just like it was in May's. Hank stopped sharpening. He looked at Dan. He was silent. Then he said quietly, "If something happens to her." He didn't finish. Dan nodded. He understood without words. That evening, May sat at the table and traced the diagram of the cracks that Dan had shown her in the mine into her notebook. Her fingers were bandaged with rags. Hank sat across from her and said nothing. Then he stood up. He walked over to his daughter. He placed his hand on her head. A big one. He said nothing. He returned to his seat. May raised her head. She looked at her father. She understood. She nodded. She went back to the diagram. Dan stood in the doorway and watched them. The old man who had spent his whole life digging ore and feared for his daughter. The girl who had wanted to dig her whole life and had finally got permission. At the notebook, where, alongside porridge recipes and weather notes, diagrams of ore layers and the angles of the supports now appeared. Level 19, the 20th on the horizon. The pickaxe is warm on her belt. The village is changing, slowly, but it's changing. Ore comes up every day. The smithy is working. Soren brews potions upstairs, in the small outbuilding that Toby helped her build. Ruth sets supports better than any man in the village. Toby forges nails that aren't crooked anymore. Hank trades ore with passing merchants, and for the first time in 2 years, the price is fair because the ore is pure. Gravelhook is breathing. Dan stands in the doorway and thinks about school, about the city underground, about how this isn't enough. 1 village, 25 houses, 43 people. Not enough. He needs more. Not for himself, for them, for everyone like them, for those this world has written off as trash because they don't know how to swing a sword. He doesn't know how yet, but he knows where. Down, always down, where the stone is, where it's quiet, where you can build. Month 2, level 22. Gravelhook has changed. Not on the outside. The houses are the same. The fences are the same. But people walked differently, faster, with their heads held high. Laughter could be heard by the well in the mornings. Children ran to the mine to watch Toby haul out the ore. Widow Ruth had repaired her fence for the first time in 6 months. Dan noticed. He didn't say anything. He just noticed. Ore came out every day. Pure, rich. Merchants from neighboring villages came once a week. They paid in silver. They used to pay in copper. What a difference. Hank distributed the money, fairly, to every family. Widows got double. Dan didn't interfere.
It wasn't his business. His business was underground. Level 22 had given him a new skill, seismic sense. He could sense the movement of rock formations up to 50 meters away. Not cracks, not water. Movement. Slow. Constant. The stone was alive. Breathing. Shifting by fractions of a millimeter a day. Dan felt it like a pulse. And one morning he felt something else. Up above. On the surface. Horses. Lots of them. Heavy ones. He stood in the tunnel at a depth of 30 meters and felt riders traveling along the road toward the village. 8.
Maybe 10. Horses in shoes. Heavy tack. Not merchants. Dan hung his pickaxe on his belt and climbed to the surface. In the square in front of Hank's house stood men in identical uniforms, blue tunics, silver buttons, a coat of arms on the senior man's chest, a crown and a feather. The Royal Mining Commission. Dan didn't recognize that coat of arms, but Hank did. Hank stood on the porch, his face as hard as stone. The head of the commission sat on his horse, looking down on the village from above. Literally, he didn't dismount. He announced that the Royal Commission had arrived to inspect illegal mining operations in the Gravel Hook area. That, according to information from the merchant guilds, this settlement was mining ore without a license from the Crown. That all ore reserves were subject to inventory and confiscation until a permit was obtained. Hank was silent. The village was silent. May stood next to her father, clutching her notebook so that her knuckles turned white. Dan looked at the commission. 10 men, 2 with swords at their belts. The rest were officials. Papers, seals, inkwells, bureaucracy. He knew bureaucracy. In West Virginia, bureaucracy had killed more mines than cave-ins. He stepped forward, calm, hands in his pockets, pickaxe on his belt, dust on his face. He said he was glad to see the representatives of the Crown, that he had a question. The head of the commission looked at him, asked who he was. Dan said he was a miner, the foreman. He'd appointed himself. There were no other candidates. The head of the commission didn't smile. He asked if he had a license. Dan asked where you got one. The head said in the capital, at the mining supervision office. Dan asked how much it cost. The head of the commission said 50 gold pieces. Dan asked how long it took to process. The head of the commission said 3 to 6 months. Dan nodded. He asked what the village was supposed to do for those 6 months. Not mine ore, not earn money, not eat. The head of the commission looked at him. He said that wasn't his concern. The law is the law. Dan paused. Then he said he wanted to show the commission the mine. In person. Give them a tour. Show them the working conditions, mining methods, safety, so the commission could compile a full report. The head looked at him suspiciously, asked why. Dan said he wanted the report to be accurate, that he had nothing to hide, that he was proud of how his mine was run, and that there was tea down there. The head of the commission got off his horse, not because of the tea, out of curiosity. They went down, all 10 of them. Dan led the way, with a headlamp, pointing things out, explaining, like a teacher. No, like a man who loves his work and wants others to understand why. Here's the support. See the angle, vertical, not slanted. That's how the load is distributed evenly. Here's the bracing, boards across the arch. They keep small debris from loosening the main support. Here's the ventilation. Feel the air, fresh, constant draft. Without this, gas builds up in the face and people die. Here's the drainage, a channel. The water doesn't pool. The posts don't rot. Here's the face, the vein. See the chip, smooth, clean. 1 strike instead of 10. Because we don't strike just anywhere, but where we need to. The commission head followed him and said nothing. At first, skeptically, then attentively, then with something resembling respect. One of the officials took out a piece of paper and began taking notes. Dan noticed and started speaking more slowly, so he could keep up. They reached the room where Soren lived. Soren wasn't there. She had gone upstairs when she heard about the commission. Dan showed them the lab. He didn't call it a lab. He said that here they study the properties of local minerals and mushrooms to improve the smelting process. The official took notes. Then Dan led them back to the tree trunk. There was a kettle on a spirit stove. Dan brewed tea, made from the dried herbs Soren had gathered upstairs. 10 members of the Royal Commission sat in the mine on overturned buckets and drank tea. The commission's head held a clay mug with both hands and said nothing. Then he said that in 20 years of service, he had seen 114 mines. Not a single one was set up like this. Dan said it wasn't difficult.
It was just the right way to do it. The head of the commission looked at him. He asked where he had studied. Dan said far away. Very far away. The foreman finished his tea. He stood up. He said the report would be ready in a week.
And that it would state the following. The gravel hook mine employs mining methods not previously seen in the Crown's operations. Working conditions exceed the standards of the mining code. It is recommended that adjust a license without the usual waiting period. Hank stood at the mine entrance and heard this. His face didn't change, but his hands stopped gripping the cane he was leaning on. The commission left. Dan stood in the square and watched them go. May approached. She asked what he had shown them. Dan told the truth. The mine. May asked why the tea. Dan said that people who drink tea with you are less likely to write bad reports. May wrote this down in her notebook, under a heading that she later crossed out and rewrote 3 times. Mr. Dan's diplomacy. Dan saw the heading and asked her to remove the word Mr. May refused. A week later, the license arrived, with the royal seal. Hank hung it on the wall in his house, next to the portrait of his wife who had died 6 years ago, the 2 most important documents in his life. By this point, Dan was already thinking about something else. He stood at the face 40 meters underground and looked down. The tunnel went deeper. Much deeper. And along with it went that strange sound. Muffled. Dead. Which was neither water, nor emptiness, nor ore. Which was something he couldn't yet identify. The pickaxe on his belt was warm. Always warm now. Like a little stove. The coil on the handle glowed even when he wasn't holding it. Level 23, 24 in 2 days. Dan dug. Lower. Deeper. As always. 3rd month. Level 30. Dan stood in the tunnel 60 meters underground and counted. Not experience. People. Up in Gravelhook, 43 people lived. Down in the mine, 12 worked every day. But new ones were coming. At first, 1 at a time. From neighboring villages. Unemployed miners. Ore miners who had been kicked out of the guilds for low output. Families who had heard that Gravelhook paid fair wages and no one had died in the mine for 2 months. Then in pairs. Then in threes. By the end of the 3rd month, 80 people lived in the village. And the village became cramped. Cramped up above. Dan looked down. At the rock. At the tunnels he had dug over the past few weeks. The adits ran off in 3 directions. The tunnel had branched out. The main branch went down. The 2 side branches diverged to the east and west. There was enough ore to last for decades. But ore wasn't everything. Dan thought about space, about chambers, about housing, about a town. He began to dig differently, not for the ore, for a place. The first living chamber appeared at a depth of 35 meters. Dan carved it out of solid granite, 8 meters by 6, 3-meter ceiling, smooth walls. The floor was level, the ceiling was arched. An arch supports the load better than a flat ceiling. Every builder knows that, but no one here knew it. Dan installed supports around the perimeter, not because the arch couldn't hold up, just to be safe, out of habit, safety. May entered the chamber first. She stood in the center. She turned her head around. She said it looked like a room. Dan said it was a room. May asked who it was for. Dan said for those who felt cramped upstairs. May looked at him. Then she took out a notebook. She wrote it down. Room number 1. Then she thought about it and crossed it out. She wrote, house number 1. Dan didn't correct her. He knocked out the 2nd cell next to it, then the 3rd, then the corridor between them. Then the staircase to the lower level. Every blow gave him experience. Every chip was clean. Level 31, 32. Skill, masonry, passive. The walls he'd cut through with his own hands became 20% stronger. Dan smirked. The system was giving him bonuses for doing what he was already doing right. In the 4th week of the 3rd month, Lena Shin arrived in the village. Dan didn't see her come. He was downstairs. May told him that evening. A young woman, skinny, with a large bag slung over her shoulder. In the bag were rolled up sheets of paper. Lots of them. She asked Hank for water. Hank gave her water. She sat down by the well and took a map out of her bag. She unfolded it. May saw it and came over. The map was beautiful. No, the map was a work of art. The lines were thin and precise. The colors were soft. Every hill, every stream, every tree. May asked what it was. Lena said it was a map of the central provinces. One she had spent 2 years drawing. One that the Royal Academy of Cartography had corrected. They removed 3 villages. They shifted the forest boundary. They added a road that didn't exist. Because that's what the governor wanted. So his province would look bigger on paper. Lena refused to sign the corrected version. She was expelled.
They took away her cartographer's license. They banned her from drawing maps under threat of a fine of 100 gold pieces. Lena had been drawing maps since she was 6. It was the only thing she knew how to do. The only thing she wanted to do. They forbade her from doing the only thing that made her feel alive. She left the capital. She headed east, without a destination. She heard from a merchant about a village that was strangely good at digging. She came to take a look. Dan went down with her the next morning. He showed her the tunnels, the chambers, the adits. Lena followed him and said nothing. She didn't utter a word for 20 minutes. Dan pointed and explained. Here's the main shaft. Here's the horizon. Here's the face. Here are the living chambers. Here will be the corridor. Here's where the staircase will be. Lena stopped in the center of the first living chamber. She took a sheet of paper out of her bag. Coal. She began to draw. Not a map, a diagram, a top view, a cross-section. She drew quickly and precisely. The lines fell onto the paper as if they were already there. She only had to trace them. In 10 minutes, she drew what Dan had been trying to explain to Hank in words for 3 weeks. The entire structure of the underground workings, every tunnel, every chamber, every turn, to scale, with directions, with depth markers. Dan looked at the drawing, then at Lena. He said it was the best map he'd ever seen in his life, and he'd seen a lot of maps, geological, topographical, engineering. This one was better. Lena looked at him, quietly, seriously. She said, it wasn't a map, it's a sketch. If he gave her time and paper, she'd make a real one. Dan said there wasn't enough paper. Lena said she knew how to make paper, from bark, from reeds, from anything. They teach that in the first year at the academy. Dan looked at her hands, slender, precise, with ink stains that had seeped into her skin forever. He said, stay, draw from scratch, as you see it. Lena didn't answer, but she stayed. She took over the second living chamber, set up a table there, made of a stone slab and 2 logs. She hung her maps on the walls, the old ones, the ones she'd drawn before the corrections. The correct ones. And she began to draw a new one, a map of something that doesn't exist on any map in the world. Underground gravel hook. A week later, a sheet measuring 1.5 meters by 1 meter hung on the wall of Lena's chamber. On it was a city that didn't exist yet, but one that had already been drawn. Every tunnel, every chamber, every staircase, every future street. Dan stood in front of the map and saw what he had drawn in charcoal on bark in the early days, only 1,000 times better, 1,000 times more precise, 1,000 times more beautiful. Lena stood nearby, silent, waiting. Dan said, I need more chambers, more tunnels, deeper. Lena nodded. She took out a blank sheet of paper, and for the first time in his life, Dan wasn't just digging, he was planning a city, together with a person who knew how to turn thoughts into lines. That evening, Dan sat at the mine entrance, alone, watching the sunset. The pickaxe lay nearby, cold to the touch. He thought about what was happening. 2 months ago, he died in a mine in West Virginia. Now he's sitting in another world. At the entrance to the mine he repaired, in the village he feeds. With people who look at him as if he knows the answers to questions they don't dare ask. He doesn't know the answers. He knows stone. He knows angles and loads and cracks and melting temperatures. He doesn't know why he's here, doesn't know what the spiral on the pickaxe is, doesn't know why the rock below sounds dead, doesn't know why the pickaxe gets warmer every day, doesn't know and doesn't ask. Because there's work to be done, and work doesn't wait for questions. Month 5, level 40. The number came at night. Dan stood alone at the face, 70 meters deep. He struck the wall, plus 10 experience. The panel flashed, level 40, and right after it, a second message, a different color, not blue, gold. The tablet of the gods has been updated. New entry, class, minor, lowest tier, level, classified, location, deeper than permitted, name, hidden. Dan read the golden letters and didn't understand. The tablet of the gods. He'd heard that name, from May, from Soren. The global record table. It listed the strongest beings in Airguard, warriors, mages, paladins, heroes, never minors, never, because minors couldn't go beyond the 9th level. The system wouldn't grant them experience. Stone didn't count. A pickaxe didn't count. Labor didn't count. Dan had reached the 40th, with a tool that defied the rules, in a world built on rules. He stood in the mine face and thought about what that meant. The golden letters faded, but somewhere above they saw them. Everyone who had access to the tablets, guild leaders, royal intelligence, and the Church of the Bright Descent. Dan didn't know that. He hung his pickaxe on his belt and headed upstairs. He had more important things to do. The underground city was growing. Gravel Hook Lower. That's what May had named it. 2 levels. The first level, 35 meters deep. Living quarters, 28 of them, each for a family of 7. Corridors, staircases, a common hall for meetings and meals, a kitchen with a stone oven, a storage room for ore and tools. The second level, 50 meters deep. Workshops, Dan's, Soren's lab, Lena's cartography room. The face, the vein. Ventilation worked on both levels. 4 shafts, constant draft, fresh air. Drainage carried water to the lower sump. From there, through the adit to the outside. 200 residents. Not everyone lived down there.
Many went down to work and came back up in the evening, but 30 families moved in completely. Dan carved out chambers for them, with alcoves for sleeping, with shelves, with stone benches. May went around every new chamber with a notebook. She drew the floor plans. She noted who lived there, how many people, what was needed. She became the chief geologist, not by title, by deed. She went down into the mine every morning. She read the rock, not like Dan, worse, but better than anyone else. She saw the cracks. She understood the layering. She chose the drilling points, not always the right ones, but more often right than wrong. Dan checked her work, corrected her, explained. May nodded, took notes, tried again. Once she found a side vein that Dan hadn't noticed. A thin one, copper, not iron, copper. Dan looked at the vein, then at May, said good work. May smiled so brightly that the camera lit up, or so it seemed to him. Soren was working in the lab, not alone. An assistant had come to help her, a 14-year-old girl from one of the new families, quiet, with quick hands. Soren was teaching her to distinguish between mushrooms, edible, medicinal, poisonous, useful for smelting, useless. The girl memorized them. Soren grumbled that young people these days were dull, but she grumbled without malice. With a mug of suspicious brew in her hand, with the shadow of a smile, which she hid behind her hair. Lena drew. Every new tunnel, every chamber, every change. The map on the wall grew. She added a 3rd dimension, a side view, a cross-section, levels one above the other, tunnels like veins, chambers like organs, stairs like vertebrae. The city on paper was a living organism. Lena drew it with the precision of a surgeon and the tenderness of a mother. Once, Dan came into her cell and saw that she had added names to the map. In every living cell stood the name of the family living there. In small letters, neat ones. Dan stood in front of the map and looked at it for a long time. Lena stood beside him, silently. Then she said quietly, "You understand what you're building?" Dan said, "A mine." Lena shook her head. She said, "No, it's not a mine." Dan looked at her. Lena said, "It's the first place in the world built for those whom the world cannot see." Dan didn't answer, but he remembered. Month 5, 3rd week. A tunnel 65 meters deep.
Dan was digging alone, as usual, deeper than the main level, to where the rock sounded different, hollow, dead. He'd been following that sound for 3 weeks now, a meter or two further every day. The rock was changing. It was getting denser, darker. The blue veins he'd seen on the first day were appearing more and more often. They pulsed, faintly, like the distant pulse of something huge. The pickaxe was hot, not warm, hot. The spiral on the blade glowed brightly. Dan struck. The rock split. Behind it, Emptiness. Not a chamber, not a tunnel. Space. He shone his light inside. A hall. Large. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The walls were covered with something. Patterns. Spirals. Similar to the one on the pickaxe, only huge, covering half the wall. And in the center of the hall stood an altar. Stone. Simple. Unadorned. A bowl lay on the altar, empty. Next to the bowl, a woman sat in the stone floor. No, she wasn't sitting. She was part of the stone. Her legs disappeared into the floor, as if the stone had risen and embraced her up to her waist. She didn't move. Her eyes were closed. Her face was calm, young. Her hair was long, white, not gray, white, like quartz.
She was wearing something resembling a priestess's robe. Simple fabric, dark, with the same spiral pattern. Dan stood in the doorway, holding his breath. She was alive. He could see her chest rising and falling, slowly, once every 10 seconds. She was breathing. The stone around her pulsed with the same blue veins, as if they were coming from her, or toward her. Dan stepped into the hall. His footsteps echoed. The woman opened her eyes, slowly, like a person waking up after a very long sleep. Her eyes were blue, like the veins, like the light of the pickaxe. She looked at Dan, then at the pickaxe, then at Dan again. And she spoke. Finally. Dan stood there, silent. The woman said her name was Ivy Calloway, that she was the last priestess of the underworld mother, that she had been waiting here for 300 years, that the stone had protected her, fed her, kept her from dying, and kept her from leaving. Because someone had to be here when the one who bears the spiral arrived. Dan looked at the pickaxe, at the spiral. Ivy looked at him calmly, as if at the rain outside the window, as if it's something expected and inevitable. Dan asked what the spiral was.
Ivy said she would explain, later. First, she would like to stand up. She hadn't stood up in 300 years. Dan stepped closer. He looked at the stone that held her feet. He placed his hand on the rock. He closed his eyes. He heard. The stone wasn't holding her. The stone was protecting her. It was different. The stone wanted to let her go. It just didn't know how. No one had asked. Dan took the pickaxe. He chose a spot, very carefully, like a neurosurgeon, not a miner. One blow, quiet, precise. The stone around Ivy's legs opened up, like a flower, like a palm. Ivy stood, unsteady, 300 years without moving. Dan offered his shoulder. She leaned on it, light, like a bird. It smelled of stone and something floral. She said quietly, "Thank you." Dan said he needed to fix a leak in the vault of this hall. "It's dripping over there in the corner. It's poor waterproofing. If it isn't fixed, the vault will start to crumble in a year." Ivy looked at him, for a long time. Then, for the first time in 300 years, she laughed, quietly, like an echo in an empty hall. She said she'd been waiting for a warrior, or a prophet, or the chosen one. But a plumber came. Dan said, "Plumbers are more useful than prophets. Prophets don't fix leaks." He fixed the leak in half a day. Then he led Ivy upstairs, slowly, through the tunnels, up the stairs. She held his hand and walked. Every step was difficult for her. 300 years. Her muscles remembered, but barely. When they reached the first level, May met them. She saw Ivy, white hair, blue eyes, a priestess's robes. May opened her notebook, closed it, opened it again. Then she simply went to get some hot soup. Ivy didn't talk about the spiral, not right away. The first few days she was getting used to things, to the light, to people, to food, to the fact that there were living beings around her who moved and talked and laughed. 300 years of silence. Even for a priestess, that's a long time. She sat in the corner of the common room and ate her soup. Slowly, In small sips, as if she were remembering what taste was, May brought her blankets. Soren checked on her health. Soren told Dan that by all laws of alchemy and medicine, Ivy should be dead. 300 years without food, without water, without movement. Impossible.
Dan said that a pickaxe that grants experience for striking stone is also impossible. Soren nodded. Period. Ivy walked through the city, slowly, leaning on a cane. She looked at everything, at the cameras, at the corridors, at the people, at the children, at the smithy, at Soren's lab, at Lena's map. She stood in front of the map for a long time, silently. Then she turned to Lena and said it was beautiful. Lena blushed. Lena never blushed, but she blushed. Ivy was strange. Not scary, strange. She spoke in riddles, not because she wanted to seem mysterious, because she didn't know any other way. That's how she was taught. From the age of 6, the underground mother speaks, not in words, but in directions. Down means toward truth. Up means toward illusion. A spiral means the path. Dan listened. He didn't understand. He nodded. He waited. On the 5th day after her release, Ivy spoke. The two of them were sitting in the temple below. Dan was repairing a second leak in the vault. Ivy sat on the altar, dangling her feet, like a child. She said that the underground mother is not a myth, not a metaphor, not a symbol. She is real. She lies down there, deep. Deeper than anyone has ever dug in the history of Airguard. She was here before the gods, before the system, before the rift. She was stone before stone became stone. Then the gods came, young, strong. They saw the Earth Mother and were afraid. Not because she was evil, because she was the first. And the first always frightens those who come after. They could not kill her, not because she is stronger, because you cannot kill a stone. You can only split it. But a split stone becomes 2 stones, 2 underground mothers. That would have been worse. So the gods did something else. 7 nails, 7 points, driven into the rock around her. Each nail holds 1 facet of the seal. 7 nails, 7 facets. Complete isolation. The underground mother cannot move, cannot speak, cannot do anything. Only lie there and count the time. 300 years. Dan listened. Kirka lay beside him, warm. He looked at her, then at Ivy. He asked, "Is Kirka one of the nails?" Ivy fell silent, looked at him. There was no surprise in her eyes, only sadness. She said she didn't know that it was possible. That when she saw the spiral on the butt of the axe, she felt something she hadn't felt in 300 years. A vibration. Through the stone, through the floor, through the bones. The underground mother stirred. For the first time in 300 years. When Dan struck the wall near the temple, Dan was silent for a long time. Then he asked, "Each of his blows weakens the seal." Ivy said she wasn't sure, but she thought so. That the sensation he was experiencing wasn't the sensation of the stone. It was the underground mother's experience. Her power, flowing through the spiral into the one who strikes, like water through a crack in a dam. Every blow widened the crack. Every level, every point of experience, every point of luck. Dan sat in the temple of the underground mother and looked at his hands, at the calluses, at the stone dust. He thought, 40 levels, each earned by his own hands, every strike precise, every chip clean. He was proud of it. Now it turned out that every blow he struck was weakening a prison. Someone's prison. Someone was lying below, and every time Dan struck the stone, the chain grew weaker. And the experience that made Dan stronger was not a reward.
It was a leak. Dan asked Ivy what would happen if all 7 nails came out. Ivy said she didn't know. That her order held on to faith but not knowledge. That the priestesses prayed to the underground mother but had never seen her. That all they knew was a single phrase, passed down by word of mouth for 300 years. The underground mother does not sleep. She waits. Dan nodded. He stood up. He picked up the pickaxe. He looked at the spiral. It glowed, steady, warm, like a tiny star embedded in metal. He told Ivy he needed to think. Ivy nodded. She said the stone wasn't going anywhere. Dan replied that he knew. The stone never goes anywhere. That is both his problem and his consolation. He went upstairs, walked through the city's corridors, past the cells, past the people, past the smithy where a hammer clanged, past the lab where it smelled of mushrooms, past the cartography room where Lena was drawing, past the schoolroom that May had set up a week ago, where 6 children were learning to read, and 3 adults too, because they didn't know how, because they had never been taught. Dan walked and thought. He is building a city on someone's cage. Every blow he strikes makes the cage weaker. If he stops striking, the pickaxe will stop granting experience. The city will stop growing. People will stop receiving the ore that feeds and warms and clothes them. If he keeps striking, sooner or later the seal will crack, and whatever lies beneath will come out. He doesn't know what it is. Ivy doesn't know. No one knows. Maybe it's salvation. Maybe it's the end. He climbed to the surface, went out onto the hill above the village, sat down on a rock, looked down, at Gravel Hook, at the houses, at the people, at the smoke from the chimneys, at May walking down the path with a basket of apples, at Toby hauling a bundle of firewood, at Ruth patching the roof. His people, not his. No, he doesn't want them to be his, but they've become his. Because he came and fixed the mine, because the stone obeys his hands, because he's the only person in this world who knows that the struts go up vertically. Because he makes lamps for May and ventilation for Soren and paper for Lena. And every time he picks up a pickaxe and strikes the rock, he does it for them. And at the same time, he destroys something he doesn't understand.
Dan sat on the hill until sunset. Then he stood up. He went down. He took the pickaxe. He went into the mine. He struck, +10 experience. He won't stop. He can't. Because down below are people who need ore. Because he's a miner. And miners dig. That's their job. Whatever truth lies at the bottom. Month 8, level 55. The city has grown. 3 tiers, 400 residents. The 3rd tier extends 80 meters deep. Workshops, warehouses, mushroom farms. Soren came up with the idea of growing mushrooms in special chambers with controlled humidity. Dan built the irrigation system for her. Water from an underground stream through stone channels. The mushrooms fed a third of the population. Lena was drawing the 4th version of the map. Each new one was more accurate and larger. May was conducting geological surveys on her own. She no longer needed Dan to check her work. Almost. Toby forged tools that were on par with those of the merchants. Ruth led a crew of 6 miners and installed supports according to Dan's standards. The school was up and running. May taught in the evenings. Rock identification, safety basics, angles of inclination, types of supports. Her notebook became a textbook, handwritten, the only one in the world. New people arrived every week, from distant villages, from cities, miners, ore diggers, artisans, weavers, potters, carpenters, all those whom the world above considered trash, the lower class, the artisan class, the apprentice class, everyone who couldn't fight and didn't want to learn how to kill. They came, and Hank met them at the mine entrance. He told them there was work, there was food. The rules were simple. Work honestly. Help your neighbor. Listen to Dan when he talks about the supports. Don't go where you're not asked. Dan stood on the 3rd level and looked at the blueprints for the 4th. The 4th level, 100 meters deep. He was planning. A library. Lena asked for a place to store the maps. Soren asked for a large lab. May wanted a real auditorium for the school. Dan was drawing with charcoal on the wall. Right on the rock. Lines. Rooms. Corridors. Stairs. Lena stood nearby and traced them onto paper. Quickly, precisely. They worked in silence. They had long since learned to understand each other without words. Dan drew a line. Lena already knew there would be a room beyond it. Dan put down a dot. Lena knew there would be a crossroads here. They worked like 2 tools in one pair of hands. On the evening of the 1st day of the 8th month, Hank came to Dan. His face was gray. His voice was quiet. He said there was a man on the surface, one, in armor, white, with a sun on his breastplate, a paladin, the Church of the Bright Descent. Dan set down his charcoal, wiped his hands, went upstairs. The paladin stood in the middle of the village, tall, broad, armor white and gold,
a sword at his belt, a young face, maybe 30, maybe younger, serious eyes. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't swinging his sword. He stood and waited. Villagers stood around him, at a distance, in silence. Dan approached. The paladin looked at him, at his helmet, at his pickaxe, at his robe covered in stone dust. He asked if he was the one they called the lower miner. Dan said his name was Dan, just Dan. The paladin said his name was Bran. He was sent by the Church of the Bright Descent to determine the nature of the anomaly recorded by the Tablet of the Gods. Class, lower miner. Level higher than permitted. Location deeper than permitted. The church is concerned. Dan nodded. He asked Bran if he wanted to eat. Bran blinked. He said he wasn't hungry. Dan said that maybe they could have some tea then. Bran blinked again. He said he wasn't here for tea. He was here for an inspection. Dan said it was better to conduct an inspection on a full stomach, and that the view was better down below. Bran was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. They went down. Dan led him through the city, just as he had shown the royal commission, but differently. To the commission, he had shown the mine. To Bran, he showed the house. Here are the living quarters. The Thomas family lives in this one. 3 children. The youngest is 2 years old. He was born here. The first child born underground in gravel hooklower. Here is the kitchen. Ruth cooks for 200 people. Every day. A stew of mushrooms and meat. Bread. Ruth silently set a bowl in front of Bran. Bran sat down. He ate. In silence. Here are the workshops. Toby is forging. Tools. Hinges. Nails. Staples. Not weapons. Never weapons. Here is the laboratory. Soren brews medicines. For coughs. For fevers. For mine gas poisoning. Soren looked at the paladin. The paladin looked at Soren. Soren said that if his throat hurt, she had a decoction. Bran said his throat didn't hurt. Soren shrugged and went back to the flasks. Here is the school. May stood in front of a stone slab and drew a cross-section of a stratum with charcoal. 6 adults sat on stone benches and watched, listened, took notes. Those who could. Those who couldn't drew pictures. Bran stood in the doorway and watched. For a long time, May didn't turn around. She was explaining what the angle of natural dip was, and why it was important, and why, if you didn't know that angle, you die, simply and calmly, like a fact. Bran listened. Then they went down further, to the 2nd level, to the 3rd. Dan showed him the face, the vein, the ore. He showed him how a pickaxe works, not his own, a regular one. He showed him how to read the cracks, how to choose the point of impact. Bran stood and watched. He was a warrior, his whole life, a sword since he was 12, armor since 16. He had never seen a man work with stone, not destroy it, not smashing it, working with it, with respect, with understanding, with patience. They went back up to the common hall. Dan made tea. Bran sat on a stone bench. His armor was white. The hall was gray. He looked like a porcelain cup in a coal bucket, beautiful and out of place. He drank his tea. He was silent. Then he said he'd been sent here with orders to assess the threat, to report, to neutralize if necessary. Dan asked what neutralize meant. Bran said it meant to kill, or arrest, or bring to the surface, where a lower-class miner would once again become what he was meant to be, a nobody. Dan nodded. He asked what he had decided. Bran set down his mug. He looked at Dan, at his hands, at the pickaxe, at the walls of the cell that Dan had hewn out of monolithic granite, at the child's drawing on the wall. One of the kids had drawn a man in a hard hat with charcoal, with a big pickaxe, and signed it in crooked letters, Dan. Bran took off his breastplate, white, with a golden sun. He placed it on the table, next to the mug, the sword. He placed it next to it. He said quietly, I can't kill a man who's building a school. Dan looked at him. Then he said, Then hold the ladder. I need to fix the lamp on the ceiling. Bran looked up. The lamp was hanging crooked.
a small bowl with oil and a wick on a stone hook. The hook was cracked.
Bran stood up, walked over to the ladder, gripped it with both hands. Dan climbed up. He fixed the hook. He adjusted the bowl. He climbed down. Bran was still holding the ladder. Dan said, "Thank you. You can let go." Bran let go. He looked at his hands, at the stone dust on his palms, at the armor on the table, at the sword nearby, at the school across the hallway, at the child's drawing on the wall. He said he didn't know what to write in the report. Dan said he could write the truth. Bran asked which one. Dan said, "This one. A miner digs. People live. Children study. No one dies." If that's a threat, then the world of Airguard has a very strange idea of what constitutes a threat. Bran didn't smile, but something in his face had changed. He said he would stay for a few days, to see, to think. Dan said the guest room was the third on the left. Ruth had a blanket. Bran stayed, for a few days, which turned into a week, which turned into 2. He took off his armor, put on work clothes, hauled stones, carried water. He helped Toby in the smithy. He was silent. He worked. On the 15th day, Bran approached Dan. He said he'd written a report, that he'd send it with a merchant. That the report stated, anomaly confirmed, no threats identified, monitoring recommended, and, at the bottom, a note in small handwriting, please consider me an observer for an indefinite period. Dan looked at him. Bran looked at the floor. He said he wasn't a miner, or a builder, but he knew how to hold a ladder. Dan nodded. He said that they had plenty of ladders, and they were all wobbly. Bran stayed, the first paladin in history to take off his armor for the sake of stone dust and work that doesn't kill. Year 1. Level 70. The city was now called Hyagard Hollow. Not by Dan's decision. By everyone else's. It happened in the evening on the day the school opened. A real school. Not a room with a stone blackboard. A hall on the second level. 20 seats. Stone desks. Stone benches. A blackboard made of polished slate. Chalk made of crushed quartz. May stood in front of the blackboard and couldn't speak. For the first minute. Then she could. Dan spent the whole day fixing the ventilation on the 4th level. He was late. He came in covered in dust. In a robe. With a pickaxe over his shoulder. He entered the hall. 2,000 people were standing. Not sitting. Standing. Everyone. Hank stepped forward, gray-haired, upright, eyes wet, hands steady. He said the city had no name. He said they had thought. He asked if they could name it after Dan. Dan was silent. The hall was silent. 2,000 people and silence. Dan took off his helmet. He looked at his hands. Calluses, soot, stone dust under his fingernails. He said, no, not in his honor. He said, call it Hyagard Hollow, in honor of his father, who had wanted a city like this his whole life, and didn't get the chance. May began to cry. She stood by the blackboard and cried, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. Ivy stood by the wall. She hadn't cried in 300 years. Now she was crying, quietly too, silently too. Hazel Morgan stood in the back row. She had come to the city 3 weeks ago, with a sword and a contract for a murder. She was left without a sword and without a contract. Now she was crying, and she was angry at herself for it. She clenched her fists and cried, and Dan stood there, because he didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know how to accept what people gave him. He didn't know how to be who they saw him as. He stood there, holding his helmet in his hands, not knowing where to look. Then he said quietly, all right, who wants some tea? The room exhaled. Someone laughed. Someone cried louder. Someone clapped. Dan went to the stove and started making tea, because that was what he knew how to do. Hazel had shown up in town 3 weeks earlier, a top-tier mercenary, level 62, a warrior, an assassin, the best in her field. The church hired her after Bran's report yielded no results. Bran wrote that there was no threat. The church didn't believe him. They sent someone who knew how to solve problems. Hazel went down into the mine at night, alone, without armor, dressed in black, with a short sword.
She passed the guard posts, past the doors, past sleeping families. She found Dan's cell on the second level. She went in. Dan wasn't asleep. He was sitting at the table drawing a blueprint for a new horn for Jaeun Park, who had come to the city a week ago. The former chief blacksmith of the Royal Armory. She had fled because she had been forbidden to make things that didn't kill. Dan was drawing her a forge with a double chamber and adjustable blast. He looked up. He saw Hazel.
He saw the sword. He said good evening. Hazel stood in the doorway, sword in hand, 3 steps to the target, 1 strike. She'd done it 100 times, with her eyes closed. Dan looked at her, then at the drawing, then at her again. He said that if she waited 5 minutes, he'd finish the line, then they could talk. Hazel didn't move. Dan went back to the drawing, finished the line, set the charcoal aside, stood. He said there was stew left in the kitchen, if she wanted some. Hazel said she hadn't come to eat. Dan said he knew why she'd come, that the pickaxe was on the hook by the wall, that he didn't know how to fight, that if she'd decided to kill him, he had one request, not to make a noise. The kids were sleeping 2 rooms over. Hazel stood there, sword in hand. Her hand didn't tremble. It never trembled. She looked at the camera, at the walls, at the drawing on the table, at the pickaxe on the hook, at the stone shelf with the 3 books Lena had bound for Dan, at the clay mug with his initials on the bottom, the one Jaeun had forged. No, molded, from clay, and fired in her kiln, because she wanted to make something that didn't kill, and she made a mug. For the man who brought her the kiln blueprint and told her to do whatever she wanted. Hazel looked at the mug, at the initials, D.H, rough, uneven, made by hands that had been forging swords for 20 years, and made a mug for the first time. Hazel sheathed her sword, slowly. She said she couldn't. Dan asked what exactly she couldn't do. Hazel said she couldn't kill a man who was repairing the school roof. She had seen him, during the day, when she was watching the city from above. Dan was standing on a ladder, repairing the stone arch above the school hall. May was holding the ladder. The kids were shouting from below so he wouldn't fall. He didn't fall. He fixed it. He climbed down. May gave him some water. He drank it and went on to fix something else. Hazel watched for 4 hours. In 4 hours, he repaired the roof, adjusted a light fixture, explained to Toby how to properly temper a chisel, listened to Soren, who was complaining about the humidity in the lab, promised to install additional drainage, talked to Ivy, who was speaking in riddles again, nodded, went down into the pit, struck the rock 100 times with his pickaxe, came back up, had dinner with Hank. Lay down to draw. 4 hours, not a single moment for himself. Everything for others. Hazel had been killing people for 15 years. She killed those she was told to kill. She didn't care who they were. She was a weapon. That's how she was raised. That's how she was taught. That's how she was broken. A weapon doesn't think. A weapon strikes. She stood in Dan's cell and for the first time in 15 years couldn't bring herself to strike. Because the target was repairing the school roof. Because there was a drawing of a horn on the table. Because there was a mug with initials on the shelf. Because children were sleeping 2 cells over. Dan said then, "Hold the ladder." Hazel Zell looked at him. She said she didn't know what that meant. Dan said it meant he had a job tomorrow on the 3rd floor ceiling and he needed someone to hold the ladder, and that she had good hands, strong ones, just right for a ladder. Hazel was silent. Then she said she was a killer, a professional, top tier, level 62. She doesn't hold ladders. Dan said Bran was a paladin, a holy warrior. Now he hauls stones on the 4th level and is happier than he's ever been in his life. Hazel looked at the door. At the hallway behind her, at the city, at the silence, at the sleeping children, at the mug with her initials. Then she sat down on a stone bench. She placed her sword on the table, next to the drawing of the horn. She said, "All right, show me where the stairs are." That was 3 weeks ago. Now Hazel was standing in the hall, crying, and angry at herself, because killers don't cry, and she wasn't a killer anymore, and she didn't know who she was now.
Except for the person holding the ladder. Dan was making tea. 2,000 people. There wouldn't be enough tea, he knew, but he made it anyway, because that's what he knew how to do. May approached. Her eyes were red. A notebook in her hands. She said quietly, Hyogard Hollow. A beautiful name. Dan looked at her, at her face, at the notebook, at her ink-stained fingers. He said thank you to May. She nodded, turned away, wrote something down. He didn't see what, but he knew. She wrote down the date. The day the city got its name. The day Dan first said thank you to her by name. Without the word sir. Level 70. 4 tiers. 2,000 residents. Its own currency. Iron coins stamped with a spiral. Ji-un minted them on her forge.
Agreements with 3 surface villages. Metal and tools in exchange for grain, meat, and cloth. A school, a library, a hospital. Soren treated patients. Ivy prayed. Lena painted. May taught. Jaeun forged. Hazel guarded. Bran carried stones. Toby grew up and became a master blacksmith. Ruth commanded the mine when Dan went down into the deep shafts. Hank sat at the mine entrance every morning, gray-haired, old, happy. The town thrived. Dan dug. Year 1, Month 6, Level 85. Higher than any living hero of Airguard. Dan didn't learn this from the system. He heard it in conversation. A merchant from the capital sat in the common hall and shared the news. The strongest warrior in Airguard. General of the Order of the Silver Blade. Level 84. The ceiling. No one had been able to defeat him in 20 years. Dan sat in the corner drinking tea. Level 85. Miner. Lowest class. He said nothing. Finished his tea. Went down the mine. But the news wasn't about the level. The news was something else. The merchant spoke more quietly. He looked around. The Church of the Bright Descent is preparing something. Something big. Rumors are circulating in the capital. Paladins are gathering in the eastern provinces. High Paladin Celestine Vone gave a speech in Cathedral Square. He spoke of heresy, about those who dig too deep, about those who violate the order established by the gods, about the hierarchy, which must only go upward. Dan listened. He nodded. He didn't interrupt. Then he asked the merchant how many soldiers the church had. The merchant said that, according to rumors, up to 15,000. Dan nodded. He thanked him for the news. He bought 3 sacks of grain and a coil of rope from the merchant. He went to Hazel. Hazel was sitting at the entrance to the 3rd tier, sharpening a knife. Not because the knife was dull, because she needed to keep her hands busy while she thought. Dan sat down next to her. He said the church was preparing a campaign. Hazel nodded. She said she knew that her former colleagues were sending word. Not out of friendship, out of fear. They know where she's gone, and they're afraid of ending up on the other side of her. Dan asked how much time they had. Hazel said 3 to 6 months. To gather an army. To reach the eastern provinces. To find the entrance. Dan nodded. 6 months. Half a year. Enough.
He stood up, went down, into the pit. Deeper than usual. Deeper than anyone in this world. The pickaxe is hot. The spiral is bright. The stone is death. Dead. That very sound he'd heard from the very first weeks. Now he knew what it was. Not dead stone. A seal. Stone around nails. Stone through which the power of the gods had passed. Stone that had ceased to be stone and become a lock. Dan struck. Carefully. Precisely. Every blow to the right spot. +10. +10. +10. Level 86. 87. He didn't stop. 12 hours straight. May came down to him, brought water and bread, saw his face, didn't ask what happened, left the food. She left. Dan ate without taking his eyes off his work, bread in one hand, pickaxe in the other. He was thinking, not about the church, about the tunnels. Hyogart Hollow stood on 4 levels, each level connected to the others by staircases and adits. There was only one entrance from the surface, the main shaft. That was a weakness.
any army could block the entrance and wait, or come in and overwhelm them with numbers. 400 meters of tunnels on the first level, 300 on the second, 200 on the third, 100 on the fourth.
Dan knew every meter, every turn, every crack, every point of stress in the rock, every section where the vault hangs by a thread, where water is eroding the support, where the stone breathes and moves. He knew his city like his own body. And he knew something else, that an army descending into an unfamiliar mine is not an army. It is a mob in the dark, in unfamiliar tunnels, without a map, without ventilation, without understanding how the rock is structured. Dan wasn't going to fight. Dan was going to rebuild the city in 6 months, so that 12,000 people would go in and not be able to get out, without a single death. He went up to Lena, told him he needed a new map, not of the city, of the labyrinth. Lena looked at him. She took a blank sheet of paper. Dan began to dictate. Faults, tunnels, dead ends, circular passages that lead back to the entrance, halls with low ceilings where you can't swing a sword, narrow passages where only one person can walk at a time, ventilation valves that can be closed and opened from a central hub, not to suffocate, to direct the air, cold air down, warm air up, to create drafts that extinguish torches, to create darkness. Water channels that can be opened to flood certain areas. Knee-deep, not dangerous, but unpleasant, and cold, and wet. Armor rusts, boots get soaked, torches go out. Lena drew, quickly, precisely. Her eyes sparkled. She understood what he was doing. He was turning the city into a mechanism, alive, controllable, safe for its own, impassable to outsiders. Dan called for Ji-un. He said he needed shutters, stone ones, on hinges, for the ventilation ducts, and gates for the water channels. And he also needed lanterns, lots of lanterns, that could be lit and extinguished from a single place. Ji-un looked at the blueprints, silently, for a long time. Then she said 2 words. How long? Dan said 6 months. Ji-un nodded. She went into the smithy. An hour later, the sound of a hammer came from there. Steady, fast. She had begun. Dan called for Soren. He said he needed gas. Not poisonous, not dangerous. Gas that smells bad, really bad. One that could be released into the tunnel and make anyone want to get out of there immediately. Soren looked at him, raised an eyebrow, said she had a mushroom that, when burned, released a substance that made your eyes water and your stomach churn. Not dangerous, but extremely unpleasant. Dan said, perfect. Soren smirked. She said she'd always dreamed of applying her knowledge to military affairs. Dan said this wasn't a military matter. It was a mining matter, just from a different angle. Soren went to the lab. Dan called Hazel. He said he didn't need an army. He needed guides, people who knew the tunnels, who could move in the dark, who could lead groups of soldiers in circles for hours until they realized they were lost. Hazel said she had 20 people, former miners, who knew the city better than the backs of their hands. Dan said, great, teach them to disappear. Hazel bared her teeth. It wasn't a smile. It was a promise. Dan worked every day, 18 hours. In the morning, the Thace, experimentation, level, Pickaxe. In the afternoon, construction, new tunnels, faults passages, dead ends, traps that don't kill but confuse. In the evening, meetings, Lena, Ji-un, Soren, Hazel, May, Bran. Everyone knew their part. Everyone did their job. Dan slept 4 hours a night. May brought him food to the worksite. He ate with one hand. With the other, he sketched. Level 88, 89, 90. Each level granted a new skill. Stone memory. He memorized every cubic meter of rock he passed through. Seismic blast. He could strike a wall and bring down the vault at a point up to 20 meters away. Controlled. Precise, not on people, on passages, to block, to cut off, to redirect. Stone shaping. He could change the shape of the rock with a pickaxe blow, not to break. Alter. Turn a wall into a door, a passage into a dead end into a passage, with a single blow. Hyogart Hollow ceased to be a city. Hyogart Hollow became an organism, with Dan as its nervous system. Year 2, Level 100, System Cap. Dan stood in the mine at a depth of 120 meters and looked at the panel. Level 100, Maximum. Below that, a line he was seeing for the first time. Error. Class does not match level. Recalculation impossible. Contact the administrator. Dan stared at the word administrator. In a world where gods grant experience through the system, the word administrator meant one thing: gods. The system was asking him to contact the gods, because it had broken down, because a miner of the lowest class cannot be level 100. It's not provided for. It's an error. It's impossible. Dan closed the panel. He picked up the pickaxe. He struck, plus 10 experience. The experience was credited. The system flashed. Error, error, error. 3 messages in a row. Dan struck again. Another 10. Another error. The system kept granting experience, and kept saying it was impossible. It was breaking down because of his existence. The pickaxe was hot. It almost burned his palm. The spiral glowed so brightly that he could see his shadow on the opposite wall. Long, sharp, with a pickaxe in his hand. The stone around him hummed. Not hollow, not dead, different. The stone sang, low, deeply, like an organ in an empty cathedral. The seal was cracking. Dan could feel it. Every blow widened the crack. Not in the stone, in something else, in something that was greater than the stone. He stopped, closed his eyes, listened, and he heard, not with his ears, not by skill, with something new, something that appeared on the 100th level, a voice, distant, quiet, like an echo of an echo. The voice said his name, Dan, just Dan, no last name, no title, like a mother calls her child, quietly, affectionately. From beneath the stone, from beneath the seal, from beneath everything, Dan opened his eyes. He looked down, stone beneath his feet. Ordinary, dark, with blue veins. But now he knew. The veins weren't a mineral, they were veins. The veins of the underground mother. They run through the entire air guard, from the surface to the bottom. All the rock he had been chiseling for 2 years, all the ore he had mined, all the walls he had cut through for chambers and tunnels and schools and libraries. All of it was her. He had been building his city inside someone's body. Dan sat up. He pressed his back against the wall. The pickaxe lay on his lap, hot. He sat and thought. 2 years, 100 levels, each one mined with a blow. Each blow took a piece of strength from the creature lying below, or which is the bottom. He was building a city on someone's bones, feeding people with someone's blood. His school stands in someone's body. His children sleep in someone's dream. Dan sat and said nothing. Then he stood up. He went up to Ivy's temple. Ivy was sitting by the altar, as always, quiet, calm, with blue eyes that saw beyond the walls. Dan sat down across from her. He said he'd heard a voice. Ivy nodded. She wasn't surprised. She said she'd been expecting this. That on the 100th level, the line between Dan and the underground mother had grown thin. That he now didn't just carry the spiral, he is part of the spiral, and the spiral is part of him. Dan asked what she wanted. The underground mother, what she wanted. Ivy paused. Then she said she didn't know. That her order had preserved faith, not knowledge. But that one thing she knew for sure. The underground mother did not want to destroy. She had been a stone before the gods. A stone does not destroy. A stone holds. Dan looked at the temple walls, at the spirals carved into the stone, at the bowl on the altar, at Ivy, at her white hair, the color of quartz. He said that in a few months the army would arrive, 12,000, that he had rebuilt the city, that no one would die, that he believed in it. Ivy looked at him. She said she believed it too, and she said one more thing, quietly, almost a whisper, that beneath the city, deeper than the fourth level, deeper than the face of the mine, deeper than anything Dan had ever dug, there is a sixth nail, the second to last, and when the time comes, Dan will find it, because nails do not hide from one who bears the spiral, they call out. Dan nodded. He stood up. He went upstairs. He had work to do. The army in 3 months. The city needs to be prepared. People need to be warned. Food needs to be stockpiled. Water needs to be diverted. Ventilation needs to be checked. 23 ventilation valves. 14 water gates. 8 false tunnels. 6 ring tunnels. 2 main dead ends. 1 entrance. 0 exits for those who don't know the city. May met him upstairs. She said Bran had brought news. Hazel's intelligence had confirmed it. The church's army had set out, 12,000 strong, under the personal command of Supreme Paladin Celestin Voen. A 3-month march, maybe 2.5. Dan nodded. He looked at May. She wasn't afraid. She was holding a notebook. In the notebook was an evacuation plan, one she had drawn up herself, without his help. Every family, every child, every elderly person, where to go, what to take, where to take shelter. She was ready. They were all ready. Dan looked at the city, at his father's city, at Hyogart Hollow. 8,000 residents, 4 tiers, a school, a library, a hospital, a smithy, a laboratory, a cartographic office, a temple, a market, living quarters. Corridors lit by glowing quartz. Children running through the stone streets, the sound of a hammer from the smithy, the smell of mushroom stew, laughter, voices, life. He built this, with his own hands, blow by blow, stone by stone, man by man, and now 12,000 people were coming to destroy it, because the gods decided that no one should dig downward, because the vertical only goes upward, because a miner of the lowest class has no right to be of the 100th level, because order is more important than people. Dan clenched the pickaxe, hot, glowing, alive. He said quietly, "No, it won't work. This is my mine, and I know every stone." They came at dawn. Dan stood on the hill above Gravel Hook and watched. 12,000. No, fewer. Some fell behind on the way. Some deserted. About 10,000 remained. White armor, golden suns on their breastplates, banners, long, heavy, pointless underground. A single man rode ahead. No banner, no retinue. In plain white armor, no gold. Celestine Voen, the High Paladin. Dan recognized him not by his armor, by his bearing. That's how people sit who carry a weight on their shoulders that cannot be taken off. Celestine was at the village. The village was empty. Everyone had gone down. All 8,000 of them. 3 days earlier. According to May's plan. Organized. Calmly. Every family. Every child. Every old person. No one was forgotten. May checked the list. Twice. Hank was the last to leave. He turned around on the threshold of the house with the red door. He looked at her. Then he went down. Dan stood alone on the hill, a pickaxe on his belt, helmet on his head, robe covered in stone dust. Celestine saw him. He walked toward him through the empty village, alone, without guards. 10,000 soldiers stood behind him, waiting. He stopped 10 paces from Dan. He looked. Dan looked. 2 men on the hill, one in white armor, the other in a miner's robe. Celestine spoke. His voice was calm, even, without hatred, without malice. He said he knew who Dan was, that he'd read the reports, from Brana, the commission, the merchants, the spies. He said he knew about the town, about the school, about the children.
about the mug with the initials and the map on the wall. He said he knew Dan was a good man, and that is exactly why he was asking. "Stop, please." Dan listened. He was silent. Celestine continued speaking.
He said he knew about the nails, that the church had kept this knowledge since its founding, that the gods had warned the first paladins, 7 nails, 7 seals. Beneath Airguard lies what existed before the gods, that which cannot be killed, that which can only be contained. Every blow Dan strikes weakens the seal. Every level brings the world closer to catastrophe. The church is not Dan's enemy. The church is trying to save the world. Dan listened. The pickaxe was hot against his belt. Then he said he understood, that he believed Celestine, that Celestine isn't lying. But he asked one thing. Had anyone asked the underground mother? In 300 years, had anyone asked what she wanted? Or had they simply decided for her? The way they decide for miners. The way they decide for those who dig. Like they decide for those they consider trash. Celestine was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You can't ask about what lies beyond the seal. Because if the seal opens for a question, it will open for everything else too." Dan nodded. He said he understood that logic too. But he said one more thing, that he had 8,000 men down there, whom this world had cast aside, whom this world considered trash, to whom this world had given nothing but dark burrows and an early death. That he won't let 10,000 soldiers come down and take away the only thing they have. Not because he's a hero, because he promised Hank, because May keeps a notebook, because Soren isn't alone anymore, because Ivy waited 300 years and finally came into the light, because Jiyun makes mugs, not swords, because Hazel doesn't kill anymore, because Lena draws maps that no one corrects, because the children are learning to read, because it's his mine, and he knows every stone. Celestine looked at him. There was pain in his eyes, real pain. He believed in what he was doing, just as Dan believed in his own cause. 2 good men, on opposite sides. Celestine said he had no choice, that he had to. Dan said everyone has a choice, it's just that not everyone knows it. Celestine turned away. He went to the army. Dan went to the mine. He went down, alone, glancing back at the sky one last time. Green on the horizon, fast-moving clouds. A single sun, not his son, but almost his. The army entered the mine 2 hours later. The main shaft, wide. Dan had widened it a month earlier. On purpose, to fit more people, so they'd feel safe, so they'd keep going, deeper, more confidently. The first 1,000 passed through the shaft and found themselves on the first level, which looked different, not like a city, like a labyrinth. Tunnels branched off in 7 directions, each wide enough for a squad, each leading to nowhere. The commanders divided the people, by tunnels, by squads. Torches burned, for now. The first valve opened an hour later. Cold air rushed into the left tunnel. The torches flickered, went out. Darkness. A 200-man squad stopped, in the darkness, in an unfamiliar tunnel, without a map, without torches, voices, shouts, panic. No, not panic, confusion. Hazel's guides worked like shadows, silently, in the darkness that was their home. They knew every turn, every stone, every step. They passed by the soldiers, tapped on the wall, created an echo, guided them. The squad followed the sound, in a circle. 20 minutes, 40, an hour. They returned to where they had started. They didn't understand. They went again, in a circle. The second tunnel, a water gate. June had made a mechanism that worked without spells. A lever, a counterweight. A stone. Water gushed across the floor, up to the ankles, cold. The armor clanged. Their boots got soaked. The soldiers cursed. They retreated. They went back. The third tunnel, Soren's mushroom gas. White smoke crept across the stone floor, tear-inducing, nauseating, not dangerous, but unbearable. The soldiers coughed. They cried. They ran back, toward the light, toward the exit, toward the surface. The fourth tunnel. Dan stood there himself, alone, in the darkness. A detachment of 300 soldiers was advancing on him. He struck the wall with a pickaxe. One blow. The stone gave way. The wall behind him became a door. The door behind them became a wall.
300 people in a stone bag, no way out, with ventilation, with water, with food he'd left in the niches, but no way out. They screamed, they pounded, they hacked at the wall with swords. The stone wouldn't give. Dan kept going, tunnel after tunnel, level after level. Each squad fell into its own trap. No blood, no pain, no death, just a dead end, just darkness, just knee-deep water, just gas that made their eyes water, just a circle they could walk around until morning. By evening, 7,000 soldiers were trapped in dead ends and stone bags, well-fed, wet, angry, alive. 3,000 made it to the surface on their own. They ran, without looking back. They threw their armor into the tunnels. They threw their swords. They threw their banners. Celestine stood at the mine entrance, alone. His army had scattered in the darkness like sand in water. 10,000, the church's finest warriors, disarmed by a single miner, without a single sword stroke, without a single drop of blood, without a single death. Just rock, just water, just darkness, just a man who knows his mine. Dan climbed to the surface. He walked out to Celestine, stood beside him, was silent, then said that there were 7,000 of his men down there, that they could be brought out, that they would be given food and water and set free, that no one was wounded, that he had promised no one would die, and he had kept his word. Celestine looked at him. There was no malice in his eyes. There was weariness, and something resembling relief. He said quietly, "You could have killed them." Dan said he couldn't. "He's a miner. Miners don't kill. They dig." Celestine nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he wanted to see what was down there with his own eyes, not as an enemy, as a man. Dan looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. "Let's go." They went down together, Dan and Celestine, two people, a pickaxe and a sword. Although Celestine had left the sword upstairs, on his own, no one asked him to. Dan led him through the real city, not through the labyrinth, through Hyogard Hollow, past the living quarters, past the kitchen where Ruth was already putting the pot on the stove, past the school, past the library where 32 books stood on the shelves, bound by Lena, written by May, based on Dan's lectures, based on Soren's notes, based on Ivy's prayers. 32 books. The first books written underground, for the people underground. Celestine stopped at every door. He looked. He was silent. He saw children running down the hallway. He saw a woman feeding a baby on a stone bench. He saw an old man repairing a lamp. He saw Toby in the smithy, a hammer in his hands, sparks in the air, a door hinge on the anvil, not a blade, a hinge. He saw Soren in the laboratory, flasks, mushrooms, the smell of herbs. She was brewing a fever remedy for a child from the new family who had arrived a week ago from the city where they'd been driven from their home because the father was a miner, not a warrior. I saw Lena in front of the map, a huge one, covering the entire wall, every tunnel, every chamber, every name, names on the walls. Celestine stood in front of the map and didn't move, for a long time. Then he turned to Dan and said that in 45 years of life he had seen 3 kingdoms, 12 cities, hundreds of villages. None of them were built like this, not a single one. Dan shrugged, said he wasn't an architect, he was a miner. He built as best he could. They went down further, to the 2nd level, to the 3rd, to the 4th. With each level Celestine walked more slowly, not from fatigue. From what he saw, workshops, mushroom farms, water channels, drainage, ventilation. 8,000 people lived underground, and they lived well, better than in most cities on the surface, because they had clean water, and fresh air, and warm chambers, and a school, and a hospital, and work, and a man who knew where to dig. They reached the Temple of Ivy. Celestine froze on the threshold. He saw spirals on the walls. He saw the altar. He saw Ivy, white hair, blue eyes, a priestess's robes. She sat by the altar and looked at him, calmly, without fear, without malice. Celestine knew what this temple was. The church had kept knowledge of the underground mother for 300 years, as an enemy, as a threat, as something that must be kept down at any cost. He stood in the temple and saw the priestess who had waited alone for 300 years, and hadn't gone mad, and hadn't become embittered, and hadn't turned into a monster. She sat and prayed.
for the world that had declared her non-existent. Ivy said one sentence to him. "You came from above, but the truth lies below. It always has." Celestine didn't answer. He stood there. He watched. Dan touched his shoulder, said, "Let's go. There's one more place." They went down even lower, deeper than the 4th level, into a tunnel Dan had dug over the past few weeks, narrow, steep, deep. The walls glowed blue, veins pulsed. The pickaxe was red hot. Dan didn't hold it in his hand and felt it pulling him down, like a compass needle. At a depth of 150 meters, the tunnel widened. A hall. Huge.
Bigger than the Temple of Ivy, bigger than any cathedral on the surface. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The walls were covered in quartz, glowing, blue, like stained glass, only alive, pulsating. And in the center of the stone hall, a nail protruded, the 6th nail, the size of a man, metal, dark, old, with the same spiral as on Dan's pickaxe, only enormous. The nail was driven into the stone right up to the head, and cracks radiated from it, thin, in all directions, like a spider web, like tree roots. The cracks glowed, the same blue. The nail held, still, but the cracks spoke, soon. Celestine stood before the nail and his face turned white. He understood what he was seeing. A seal, one of 7, the second to last, the one that holds the world in place. And it is cracking. He turned to Dan, said that now he could see, that Dan had shown him the truth. But the truth doesn't change the fact that the world is in danger, that if the seal breaks, no one knows what will happen. Dan stood before the nail, pickaxe in hand, hot, glowing, alive. He looked at the spiral, on the nail and on the pickaxe, identical, mirrored, key and lock, hammer and nail.
He told Celestine that he was right, that he didn't know what would happen, but he knew one thing, that for 300 years someone had been lying down there, nailed to the stone. Not because he was guilty, because the first ones were afraid and decided for him, just as they decide for the miners, just as they decide for the ore miners, just as they decide for everyone they consider inferior, that if a monster lies down there, he will face it head on. And if there's someone down there who's in pain, then he'll do what he's always done. He'll go back, for his own, because that's what his father taught him. If something's moaning in the pit, you have to go there, not pray. Celestine looked at him, at the miner from West Virginia, at the man who built a city underground, who disarmed an army without a single blow, who stands before the seal of the gods with a pickaxe in his hand, and is about to do what no one has done in 300 years, to look down. Celestine lowered his head. He stood there, then he raised it. He said he couldn't stop him, that he'd tried, that he'd brought an army, that he'd lost, not because Dan was stronger, because Dan was more righteous. Not in everything, but in the most important way, in that you can't build a world on someone's back pressed against a rock and call it order. Celestine took off his breastplate, white, without gold. He laid it on the rock next to the nail. He said he would stand by his side, no matter what happened. Dan nodded. He turned toward the nail, raised the pickaxe, closed his eyes, heard a voice, from below, quiet, warm. The voice said, "Thanks for coming, son." Dan opened his eyes, looked at the pickaxe, at the spiral, at the nail, at the cracks, at the blue light, at Celestine behind him, at the walls that pulsed like a heart. He knew there was another nail behind this one, the 7th, the last, somewhere deeper, somewhere further. He still had to dig, but right now he was here, in front of the 6th one, with a pickaxe pulling him down, with a voice calling out, with the city behind him, with people waiting. He chose a spot, as always, read the stone, found a crack, found a line, found an angle. One strike, precise, careful, not destructive, understanding, as always. The pickaxe entered the stone next to the nail. The chip ran along the lines Dan saw with his eyes closed.
The stone around the nail opened up, like a flower, like a palm, just like with ivy back then, only bigger. The sixth nail wavered, swayed, and slowly, very slowly, it began to emerge from the stone. It didn't fall. It didn't fly out. It came out, on its own, as if it had been waiting for that strike for 300 years. The hall shuddered. The blue light grew brighter. The walls glowed. The quartz sang, with the same low, deep sound Dan had heard from the very first day. Only now it was louder, clearer, freer. The nail lay on the floor, dark, silent, dead. The spiral on it had gone out. The pickaxe in Dan's hand grew hotter. The spiral on the blade unwound, turn by turn, slowly, like a spring that had been held for 300 years and finally released. And Dan heard it. Not a voice, a sound, far below, deeper than anything, deeper than stone, deeper than the world. Someone sighed, long, heavy, like a man who had finally been able to straighten his shoulders. And somewhere far above, on the surface of Airguard, under the open sun, for the first time in 300 years, the earth trembled. In Gravelhook, a mug fell from a shelf. In the capital, a stained glass window in the cathedral cracked. At the Royal Academy, plaster rained down. People stopped. They raised their heads. They looked down. For the first time, not up, down. Because the earth told them what Dan had known from day one. Everything that matters lies beneath our feet. You just have to dig. Dan stood in the hall, a pickaxe in his hand, hot, glowing, alive. The spiral was unwinding, blue light pulsed. The sixth nail lay on the floor. One remained, one, somewhere below, deepest of all. Dan looked at Celestin. Celestin stood pale, quiet, stunned, but standing, not running, standing nearby, just as he'd promised. Dan looked at the pickaxe, at the stone, at the light, at the darkness below that was waiting. Then he turned and went upstairs, to his people, to May, who was waiting with a notebook, to Hank, who was waiting at the entrance, to Soren, who was waiting with a mug of suspicious brew, to Lena, who was waiting with a blank sheet of paper, to Ivy, who was waiting with a prayer, to Ji-yoon, who was waiting with a new mug, to Hazel, who was waiting with her hands ready to hold the ladder, to Toby, to Ruth, to Bran. To the 8,000 people waiting in the city he built, in his father's city, in Heggart Hollow. He walked through the tunnels, a hard hat on his head, a pickaxe on his belt, dust on his face, calluses on his hands, a miner, lowest class, a level above the ceiling, the strongest creature in the world who doesn't know how to fight, who only knows how to dig, and build, and repair, and teach, and listen to the stone, and return for his own. He climbed to the first level. May was standing by the ladder, a notebook in her hands. Her eyes were wet. A wide smile. She asked, "Well, what?" Dan looked at her face, at her ink-stained fingers, at the notebook in which every minute of his life in this world was recorded. He said, "One more. The last one." But not today. He had other plans today. May asked what they were. Dan said he wanted some tea and to fix the light on the third level and maybe get some sleep. For the first time in 6 months. May wrote it down. Then she closed the notebook. Then she rested her head on his shoulder for a second, just 1 second, and she stepped away. Dan was standing there, hard hat in his hands, pickaxe on his belt, the city all around.
His city, his father's city. A city for everyone the world has cast aside. A city where miners learn to read, where blacksmiths make mugs, where murderers hold ladders, where priestesses weep with joy, where cartographers draw what they see, where alchemists brew medicine from mushrooms, where children run through stone corridors and laugh. Somewhere down below,
The underground mother squared her shoulders. Somewhere above, the world shuddered. And here, in the middle, between the sky and the depths, stood a miner from West Virginia, with a warm pickaxe, with calluses on his hands, with people behind him, and ahead lay the final nail. And work, as always, just work.